hello. I seem to have drawn the short straw and got the lunchtime slot. But I am pleased to be here, whether you are pleased or not. So hi, I'm going to talk about queues, and specifically about RabbitMQ. I'll start by just saying a little tiny bit about queues, in case anyone doesn't have one in their stack. Queues are amazing. I love them because they have saved me both in greenfield projects and when I'm working with legacy systems. Like, you can retrofit a queue and save yourself from all kinds of pain. They provide a brilliant scaling point, so you can scale parts of your system sensitive to where the bottlenecks actually are and not having to pay for your whole application tier several times over. They can serve as a really nice interface point between two different teams owning different components, or two different pieces written in different technology stacks. So if you don't already have a queue in your system, then you probably will have soon. I'm speaking specifically about RabbitMQ because I think it's fabulous. And it's an open source project. It's written in Erlang, it's cross-platform, you can run it wherever you like, run it on your laptop, run it on your dev platform, run it on your existing servers, run it in your cloud. I do get mine from Compose, but I've been told to keep my fangirl tendencies under control. So that's all I'm going to say about that. I rarely feel this qualified to give talks, but I have failed with RabbitMQ many times, so I have a veritable chocolate box of possible failures to share with you, and some ideas around how you can configure to prepare for things going wrong, and also how you can respond to that when it happens. The most common problem is, of course, the message that you hoped would be processed was not processed. And the first question you need to ask is, do you care? If I don't get a pop-up on the web page about how a friend of a friend pressed the like button on an image your sister uploaded 3 weeks ago, like, do we care? Because if we don't care, then we don't need to spend time, effort, resources on making sure that message gets where it should go. We can just drop it. If it's no use, if it's 5 minutes late, or 25 minutes late, or 25 hours late, then we can just drop it. If you don't care about making sure your messages are delivered, then you can configure Rabbit to expect this. Just tell your queue that it should acknowledge. So as soon as the message comes off the queue and is given to a consumer, Rabbit stops worrying about it. Consumer might process or might not, but you don't care. If you do care, then you can indicate that too. The queue can be set up to require the acknowledgement. So the consumer takes the message and must, within a certain time window, and you want to configure that time window correctly, acknowledge that the message has been processed. If that doesn't happen, the queue will give it to another consumer for it to have a go at processing it. Sometimes that isn't what you want. Sometimes you can identify that this worker can't process this message in this moment. So you can reject that message and mark it for requeue. What Rabbit doesn't have is built-in retry logic, so you can't do that a fixed number of times. It's like if you see a message that looks like this, requeue it. But then you can easily kind of get stuck in a mess. Retries are not hard to implement though, so all you need to do is identify that you need to retry. Create a new message, because messages are immutable, so you can't edit the message. Make a new message that's exactly like the old one, and add some retry data. Maybe you want to retry for a fixed time window. Maybe you want to retry a certain number of times. Your worker can implement that logic and add the data into the message, and then put it on the back of the queue. This is quite neat because it avoids you repeatedly trying to process something that you can't process. But also, the difference between reject with requeue, which puts it back on the front of the queue, and this kind of manual retry stuff is it puts on the back of the queue, and sometimes a few extra seconds that it takes to get all the way back through the queue while other stuff is getting processed can be all you need for whatever that glitch was to go away. This also gives you the opportunity to reject after a fixed number of times. So you don't get into a situation where there's a message that can never be processed. Be defensive when you write workers and consumers. If something goes wrong, exit the script. It's normal to run those consumers under some kind of supervision. The tool's actually called Supervisor D. There's a bunch of others, but that's the one I usually use. So your script can just exit, and something else will put more workers into the pool. We normally have a bunch of those. So be defensive. If something goes wrong, bail immediately. If you can identify that something is wrong, then you can let Rabbit know, and you can reject the message. If this is just bad data, you can reject it and mark it don't requeue. And then we'll never try. We'll never try to process that message. We'll avoid having poisoned messages clogging up our queue with the worker working really hard trying to reprocess them all the time. Because we can identify that we can't process them. We can throw them away. If you don't want to actually lose them, then you can use something called a dead letter exchange. Configure your queue that dropped messages should go into a different exchange. It's not a special exchange. You just give the name of it as config. So you have an exchange with a queue attached. The queue is configured with a dead letter exchange, which is the name of some other exchange. It's a first-class exchange. You work with it in the normal way. The queues are attached in the normal way. You consume messages from the queues in the normal way. Stuff will end up here if you rejected it without requeue. If the message exceeds its TTL, time to live, when you create a message, say how long it's valid for. If it's no use after 5 minutes, you can say that. And therefore, if something happens and your workers get stalled and your queue is filling up, that stale data will tidy itself up. It'll just expire. You can report on it because it lands in the dead letter exchange. Stuff will also go here if the queues get too long. And you can try to set things appropriately. If you're running on traditional hardware, like there's not just going to scale up forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. If you put enough messages in enough queues in RabbitMQ, it will fall over eventually. I've tried. Once things have ended up on the dead letter exchange, all is not terminally lost. You have a few options here. It is usual to run some kind of consumer that gives you really decent logging. You need this to understand when things have gone wrong on your system. So normally we just have some kind of consumer that pulls everything off, gets it all recorded, usually records the message body verbatim, and then you can always use it to put it back on a queue later if you want to. I worked with one system that relied on a particularly flaky third-party API. No, like more flaky than normal third-party APIs. Regularly would go down for a few hours at a time. So we had dead letter exchanges that just collected these messages that got dropped. And once the third-party API came back online, we had a worker that we would turn on that would then put everything back in the queue it came from, and things would get processed. Because in that use case, it was worth having that data processed, although it was late. Knowing what normal looks like for your system is vital. If somebody comes to you and says, hey, there's 1 million messages in the queue and something's wrong, you should know if that is normal for your system or not. Right? You should have some sense of what normal looks like for your queue. How many messages should be in your queue? Well, I'm not a consultant anymore, but it does depend. The answer really is it depends. It's more about how long messages spend in the queue, right? Because if the answer is a week, probably something's wrong. If the answer is about 2 minutes most of the time, that's fine. You just have a lot of throughput. I think that's quite ordinary. Metrics that I like when I work with queues, size of queue is a big one. The RabbitMQ admin tools will give you this. Worker uptime. How often are your consumers restarting? They should be restarting, but if they normally restart about every 18 hours and they start restarting every 18 seconds, you should probably know that and you should probably care. Whichever tool you're using to look after those worker scripts can give you that data. I also like to know, for each type of message, how long it's taking to get processed. Again, if this changes radically, you need to know. Maybe it's not the end of the world if there's a network timeout and it takes a bit longer to get processed, but that is resource spent waiting, which could be working on some of your other jobs. So you don't want to do that. It's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but here's a recap. The ideal case, plan A, we process the message and everything is awesome. Sometimes that's not how the internet works. So if not, look at your failure and decide if it's temporary. If it is, you can just mark that message to reject and requeue. It's the same as your worker bailing, because if you have the ACK required, it will get requeued anyway. If it is not a temporary failure, if it's a permanent failure, then you just drop the message. Try and identify that we can never process it. Don't let it get stuck in a loop. You can optionally use the dead letter queues here. In contravention with normal use of flowcharts, I've added a not sure option between yes and no, because sometimes you don't know if this is temporary or not, right? So if we don't want this, if it's late, then just don't worry about it. If we still want to try and process this message, then what we need to do is implement that retries. Let's give it 5 attempts, see if we can process it, and if not, give up and send it to the dead letter queue, reject it. Yeah, bit of a speedy overview. That's it from me. Some resources here. I'll be around through lunch and for the rest of the day, and I'm happy to chat. Thanks for your time.